everyone. Welcome to Teen Suicide, a new pandemic. My name is Dr. Monique Swift, and I will be the moderator for this evening. The program that we've put together for you this evening has as its intention to raise awareness and understanding about the suicide crisis that we are currently seeing with our Black youth. We also want to respond to questions that you may have about this subject matter. So please be prepared to any questions that come up for you. You can put them in the QA box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that question and answer icon, and you'll be able to insert your question that way. So this evening's program is being hosted by the New Jersey Black Issues Convention in conjunction with the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. And just a little bit about each of these organizations. New Jersey Black Issues Convention, or NJBIC, was established in 1982 under the inspiration of Congressman Walter Fauntroy's work, the Black Leadership Family Plan, and the mission is predicated upon that plan. And New Jersey BIC is comprised of a variety of member organizations, one of which is the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. ABPsi, or the Association of Black Psychologists, was established in 1968. It's an international organization of Black psychologists. I currently and proudly sit as the president of the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. And our members are brilliant scholars and professionals who are not only at the top of their field as psychologists, but who are also committed to the liberation of the African mind, the empowerment of the African character, and the illumination and enlivenment of the African spirit. And it is from within this ABPsi family that we've assembled a panel of psychology professionals who will help us to better understand this epidemic of Black youth suicide. But before I introduce our illustrious, distinguished panelists, I'm eager to share with you remarks from Congressman Bonnie Watson Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, and I am indeed honored to speak at your conference today. Since my first days in Congress, I have fought to close the racial mental health gap and pursue equity in all aspects of healthcare. Americans' collective mental health is at a low point. After all, we're in the third year of a pandemic that has brought about widespread isolation, uncertainty, and suffering. There's no question that Americans are hurting, and it's long past time Congress took action to address that pain. As a grandmother, youth mental health is a particular important issue for me. Mental health struggles often begin at a young age, and youth mental health was on a rapid decline in the decade leading up to the pandemic. The Surgeon General's office reports that between 2009 and 2019, the share of high school students reporting persistent sadness or hopelessness increased by 40%, while the share of those contemplating suicide increased by 36%. The youth mental health crisis also disproportionately affects Black and brown youth. And the first step toward addressing this crisis is getting these underserved communities the resources they so desperately need. Whether as policymakers, care providers, or advocates, we must all prioritize eliminating disparities in access to and quality of treatment. Mental health care is essential, and in many cases, even life-saving. We live in the richest country on the planet, and every American should be able to receive the care they need when they need it. But as we know, this is far from the reality that we live in today. As a member of Congress, it is my mission, my civic duty, to change that reality. That's why in 2019, I launched the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force, on Black youth suicide and mental health. Our report found alarming increases in suicide rates among Black youth, largely due to systemic inequities in access to mental health care. In youth ages 10 to 19, suicide is the second leading cause of death, and Black children under 13 are twice as likely to die by suicide than their white peers. And the Black suicide rate is still on the rise. I refuse to let my grandchildren grow up in a world where mental health struggles among Black children and adolescents go unaddressed. In response to the task force findings, I introduced the Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act. My bill would directly address structural inequities in mental health care by investing in inclusive mental health services, increasing funding for minority fellowships, and directing resources to federal departments and agencies. On top of this, I established the Black Mental Health Brain Trust earlier this year to further fight racial disparities in access to care. By forming a unified front of researchers, practitioners, and advocates, the Brain Trust is working to create a mental health system that works for all. Of course, policymaking isn't the be-all, end-all solution to the racial care gap, and I'm so grateful to be fighting alongside organizations like the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists. On top of your tireless advocacy for structural change in our mental health care system, your organization has done the work of recruiting and training a Black mental health workforce. Investing in culturally competent care is one of the most important things we can do toward advancing equity in mental health, and I want to thank you for your efforts toward doing so here in New Jersey. By putting equity first, we can close the racial care gap and get one step closer to putting an end to our country's mental health crisis. Thank you, and God bless.
Again, that was Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman, and we thank her for her heartfelt remarks. We thank her for her fearless leadership, and we thank her for her deep love and commitment and tireless labor on behalf of Black people. So with that, I want to stop my share, and I'm excited to introduce to you all this evening our distinguished panelists. Our first panelist that I'm delighted to introduce to you comes from New Jersey, Dr. Joseph Connell Sr. Dr. Connell is a psychologist, a licensed attorney, and an ordained minister. He is immediate past president of the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. He is board certified through the American Association of Christian Counselors. He specializes in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety disorders as well, with a special focus on cognitive neuroscience. Dr. Connell has lectured at various universities and sits on the board of directors for court-appointed special advocates. Dr. Connell maintains both a law and a counseling practice in Toms River and Mount Holly, New Jersey. We welcome Dr. Connell to the panel. Thank you for being here with us.
Good evening, everyone.
Our next panelist comes out of New York City, and her name is Dr. Jamila Codrington. Dr. Codrington is a New York State licensed psychologist. She's founder and CEO of Asili Services Incorporated. She provides holistic and culturally aligned psychological interventions and consultation services, and empowers communities of African descent by raising awareness of mental health education and social justice issues. Dr. Codrington has authored publications in numerous professional journals, as well as 2 book chapters. She is a past president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists, where she has been an executive board member for over 15 years. Let's welcome Dr. Jamila Codrington to the panel. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Yes. Our final panelist is a brilliant rising star. She's an up-and-coming scholar coming out of Washington, D.C. via Jersey City, New Jersey. I am pleased to introduce Ms. Jonisa Hickson. Ms. Hickson is a master's level clinician, DC licensed psychology associate, and clinical PsyD candidate at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Ms. Hickson has led numerous workshops for mental health professionals in racial trauma and its mental health impact on the Black community. Ms. Hickson is an NJBIC Student Circle Communications Chair and the CEO and founding member of a DC registered 501c3 nonprofit organization called Dear Black Prophets, which is rooted in the pedagogy and praxis of the Black Panther Party. Please welcome Ms. Hickson to the panel. Thank you, Ms. Hickson. Thank you all for being here. I welcome each of you to the panel this evening, and thank you for the exceptional work that each of you do in your corners of this field that you do. Before or as I begin, I want to just share my screen one more time, if I may, because I want this image really to be this image. You can see the graph, I hope. I want this to kind of be seared into the minds of our attendees as we talk about this. This is a visual depiction. This graph here essentially is showing the trend of suicide among Black youth, both male and female, across a 17-year span from 2001 to 2018. And so what we know right now is that the suicide death rate among Black youth has been found to increase much faster than all of the other racial groups. Historically, Black people have had the lowest rate of suicide, so much so that we've had a trope in our community that Black people don't commit suicide, right? But now we see that our youth under age 13 are twice as likely than their Caucasian counterparts to die by suicide. And of course, what we're seeing here is not just the youth, right? That we recently mourned the death of Chelsea Chris and Ian Alexander, who is the Regina King's son, and Chelsea Chris, of course, Miss USA. But there are hundreds and hundreds of other unnamed, unknown Black youth and adults who somehow have arrived at the conclusion that death is somehow better than life. And so I want to kind of open this discussion this evening with helping to frame an understanding for why we're seeing what we're seeing, what is going on, where historically it was something that was, not an issue in our community, to now we're outpacing all other racial groups when it comes to suicide, and most particularly when it comes to young people. What's going on and what's driving this increase? Whoever wants to kick off.
Well, I think, if I may, pardon me jumping in
please.
first.
No, please, thank you.
What's at the forefront of my mind is, and I know we were going to talk about this maybe a little later, but just the advent of technology and how that, the fact that we're moving more deeply into the technological age is a double-edged sword, because while, yes, information is vastly and fastly available at our fingertips, we are also more able to witness and consume Black death, witness and consume, people dehumanizing us in ways that might look like, the fact that we are not meeting the Eurocentric standard of beauty. We're seeing more instances of people enjoying capitalism and opportunities that may be denied to us. And it's coming, at an alarming rate. Just, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, there were three videos of people, Black young kids dying on the internet, and people consuming that like that's normal, like that's natural, and just becoming desensitized to Black death. And so I think the fact that we have, our kids are being more and more given technology, even in the school systems, that's a way that they're kind of becoming desensitized to Black death, and also, their racial consciousness is increasing maybe at an earlier rate than what we might have experienced or earlier generations might have experienced. So they're becoming aware of social injustice more quickly in different ways than parents might want them to. And I think that's the thing that's at the forefront of my mind.
Okay, so technology being one of the factors, social media, seeing the repeat over and over the deaths and the overexposure of that. Any other thoughts in regard to what might be driving this trend?
Well, I would tend to think that there's an illusion of connectivity amongst us when it comes to social media. Uh, we go by the likes that we receive on Facebook, the responses to our tweets, the varying other forms of people showing that they approve of us. But in reality, we are socially divorced from everyone who we speak to. I mean, who would be paying attention to us on in this media form. At the closer we seem to be, the further we are actually away. It's an illusion, and I believe that that pertains a lot to the aspect of bullying, which is are sort of like actually been put on remote control these days, because you don't even have to be in front of the person in order to bully them and to shame them and to embarrass them. You can just get on social media and just tweet about them, and the next thing you know, you have all sorts of raising psychological problems that in where we have put our stock into that, and we have kind of walked away from the standard communication within the home. That has also been on the decline. These things portend an increase in depression, an increase in anxiety, and a tendency toward futility, a feeling of futility. I mean, to be Black in America is to be in a state of a constant low grade depression based on everything we have seen in the recent past to begin with. Those are just a couple of my thoughts on the subject. There's more to say, but I'd rather defer to my other panelists.
Anything, Dr. Cotterton, if you want to chime in on that one?
Sure, I think the comments thus far are spot on. I want to share a little bit about first the distinction between suicide attempts and suicide completions. And we recognize that the data is different. When we look at what's happening with the number of Black teens that are actually attempting suicide and the number of Black youth that are completing suicide. And what we realize, and this is where the numbers and the data is so critical, is that in addition to the suicide rates increasing dramatically for teens, and this has been happening literally since 1980s. The CDC has shared very clear data in this way. But we also know the means in which they are dying, and they are dying by firearm. They are dying by firearm. So it's not just about, are they attempting suicide and are they completing suicide, but how are they completing suicide? So if we understand that over time, the suicide deaths among African-American teens are largely accounted for by firearm suicides, we have to understand gun violence, because suicide by firearm is the corollary of homicide by firearm. And we have to understand that with gun violence, it's tied to urban poverty. It's tied to our communities being more and more segregated, the history of divestment and the lack of just policing in our communities. And so people are arming themselves at greater rates. And we also know that there are a lot of political reasons why there are more guns in our community. It's not also something that is random. So when you mix those things together, right, as what we've heard before, the trauma of racism, the low-grade depression that we're all going through, what it means to sort of be socially isolated, what's happening with technology, and then you combine that with what's happening socially and understanding that the guns in our community are accounting for the greatest number of our suicides, we have to address this with a multi-pronged approach.
That's so key.
I agree.
So key. I agree as well. And I like how you're bringing in the structural element of what there's a contextualization that's happening here that we can't ignore. These are not just individuals who are kind of just struggling with some sort of individual level stuff. There's also kind of structures at play here that are influencing how they're experiencing the lives that they experience and why they feel that they want to take that route, that death somehow is better than life. And I liked how you pulled in all of those elements with the technology and the social disconnectedness that Dr. Cano spoke about, and with the structural so forth. And we do have to, I noticed also in my research that the lethality, right? The means in which people are killing themselves, it is becoming more increasingly lethal. And you're right, guns are a big piece of that. And so looking at the structural piece though, I want to kind of move a little bit into this. We're talking about teen suicide, not just teen suicide, but teen suicide in Black youth, right? And so it said that Black youth experience an average of 5 racial discrimination experiences daily. 5 racial discrimination youth, right? And so this is a host of a range of experiences. It could be a direct experience, it could be third party, it could be witnessing something third party, or you see it online or something. But nonetheless, and on average, 5 experiences. How relevant is racism as a risk factor, and how then does it also connect to somebody actually making that final decision? Any thoughts on that? Anyone?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, Dr. Swift. Neighborhood violence is a major issue. Economic insecurity is another issue. Adverse childhood experiences, historical trauma, generational trauma that they've witnessed, the consistent re-traumatization, excuse me, by watching time and time again, Black youths being beaten, abused, shot by the police. I mean, we can go on and on. It leads on to depression. There's a breakdown in the family unit. There's poor familial support in many instances. There's a substance abuse problem. There's bully victimization. There's racism and discrimination in general. We talk about the things we can track. We talk about the things that we can record in the CDC. But we all know, as men and women of color, as people of color, what goes on in the house stays in the house. You know, it's hard to get our people to come out and admit to anything. So I would tend to say that we are grossly understating at this particular point the extent of the trauma that we're enduring. The most recent suicide I heard of was a Black child 6 years old that committed suicide. How does a child 6 years of age formulate the intent to take their own life? This is an ongoing problem. We are witnessing it, but once again, there's a generational component here that's attached to it. Incarceration, family violence in the home, the curse of poverty, the marginalization of our concerns by the greater society or the so-called greater society. These are all factors that affect us. And they work in the aggregate. So therefore, you know, we just sit there like a pot simmering until the day we just boil over. Suicides among black youths since the last CDC study, which I think was in 2018, has risen over 3 times. Like I said, once again, that's what we're seeing reported. And Dr. Codrington mentioned the attempts at suicide. Suicide is not something that just usually is a spontaneous act. You work your way up. You have to want to kill yourself to do this. And that means you have to overcome the many survival techniques or the many survival instincts that have been instilled in us from birth. We have to overcome these things and then turn and say, I give up. There's nothing more for me here. And, you know, as a person who's involved with the clergy, unfortunately, I see that in the church and I see it outside of the church. There's very little difference in the statistics, unfortunately. But I can talk about that as we go forward.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on that in terms of racism being a factor of suicide?
I think, I'm sorry, Dr. Codrington, I'm just so like amped up because
Go for it.
when I'm in class and everywhere else for that matter, I'm always the one pulling the race card, quote unquote. So saying this is inextricably tied to racism. This is racism. Da, da, da. But I feel like it's because it's so salient that we don't, or some people who, you know, might not have the consciousness to connect these things, these patterns that we're seeing that are happening in our educational system, in our work setting, in our community setting. I feel like it's just very overwhelming. And the fact that our kids are being obliterated in schools, you know, has a lot to do with, I think, you know, their inability to visualize a future for themselves, to dream for better for themselves, because they're getting so many different messages, again, in the schools, in the workplace, in the community, on the media and social media and all these different things that they're about, you know, that their life is not worth anything, and that, you know, people might not care if they decide that they want to reconcile with their pain by killing themselves. And so I think that racism has everything to do with the rise in suicide rates that we're seeing, because again, there is nowhere we can go as Black or African people across the diaspora that this construct of racism and capitalism and imperialism will not touch us. Because, you know, as a student in graduate school, I'm still experiencing things that are racist, that are harmful, that I know are overwhelming sometimes. And I can imagine, you know, being a little person and feeling these things and not being able to verbalize, you know, and make those connections because your frontal lobes are not developed, or because Broca's areas is inhibited. And I also think that we forget oftentimes that as African Black people, we are spiritual beings and we are interconnected in such a way that, you know, we can't necessarily name. So even if a 5-year-old is not able to say, you know, I'm in so much pain and I'm feeling the pain of my ancestors prior to even coming, you know, to this earth, I think that they're dealing with all that and they can feel that in ways that other children might not be able to. So before I ramble on, those are my thoughts.
Thank you on that. Dr. Codrington, you wanted to also chime in?
Well, I just wanted to add that when we think of racism, we know there are multiple manifestations of racism. And I think we've been talking a lot about systemic racism and what it looks like at the hands of white supremacy. But I also want to add into the dialogue internalized racism and the role that that plays inside of suicide. And when you think about what it means, especially this idea of even for a 6-year-old, right, to take one's own life, that's the tip of the iceberg. And what is underneath that is often a slew of thoughts about oneself, one's self-worth, the way that we evaluate ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, what we believe is possible for our future, the way that we believe other people see us. And although on the surface, it's a killing of oneself, it's actually the killing of what is represented as our social experiences as an individual that give birth to how we see ourselves. And so I say all of that because we have to recognize that there has been a huge, huge influx in efforts to really use sort of product of media, whether it be social media, whether it be in the entertainment industry, whether it be books, music. These are things that are intentionally designed to shift how we see ourselves and to sort of socially re-engineer our self-love and our self-worth. And I think that we want to make the connection and connect those dots, because the systemic racism, oftentimes for young people who are still developing their sense of self and who are still understanding who we are as African people and the contributions that we've made and the glory of our story, that they're a lot more susceptible to internalized racism. And I think that suicide is a byproduct of that.
Wow. Yeah. I'm as I'm listening to you all speak, I'm finding myself building the image of what a young Black person experiences, what the world is like from that perspective. Having all these external systemic pressures and stressors that you deal with every day, to see yourself being devalued on social media constantly. But then how, Dr. Codrington, you brought in the other piece of the internalization, right? So there's these external assaults constant, but then there's this kind of internal assault as well that's happening with these young Black people that kind of eviscerates their personhood. And when you're absent, right, within yourself, then I guess right there is a vulnerability or a susceptibility toward, my life, I'm worthless, right? What difference does it make? So, wow, you're really helping me to kind of understand and see that. So anything more? I wanted to kind of look at, since we're talking about, Ms. Hickson went into the experience that young people have in schools. And I want to look at schools, if we can, for a minute, because children spend roughly 19%, it said, of their waking hours in schools. And so I wanted to kind of explore, are there, there was a question in the chat about the microaggressions, which I think, Ms. Hickson, you spoke to a little bit already, but I want to look at the school. The school's officials and the system, is there any responsibility that you think schools have? What should be done in schools in order to kind of mitigate the rise of suicides that we're seeing with Black youth? Any thoughts? I want to kind of defer to you, Ms. Hickson. I know this is kind of an area of specialization for you, but of course, if anyone else has anything they want to add, go right ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm doing my my current practicum at a school. I was also at a school last year in the Southeast District of DC. And so a lot of the things that I was seeing is that, and I feel like, not to toot my own horn, but a lot of the teachers and parents give me feedback. They're like, I love the work that you're doing with these kids. They're improving. And it's like, I'm literally doing nothing that is not African centered. I'm prioritizing the relationship between myself and the student. I'm validating their experiences, normalizing them, giving them space to process and share, their experience, because they are the experts. And I think that a lot of the feedback that I'm getting from them is that my teacher doesn't believe me. My teacher talks to me like I'm a grown man and I'm a child. My teacher put me in this classroom because they don't want to deal with me. And so I think a lot of them are, again, conscious of that school to prison pipeline without, of course, having the language. And they're internalizing, what they're seeing. They're internalizing that, they get to learn about their history and the same people in 1 month. Even had a young white kid, a kindergarten, who said that they hated Black people in the school I'm at, and they also didn't understand why we had to learn Black history. And so when you're growing up and hearing things like that, I think, again, like we all mentioned, that you internalize that and you don't really know what to make sense of. How to make sense of that, because it goes against every, ontological belief that we have, that people are good people, and that if I'm a good person, then this person is a good person. But I think that it's just the structure of the schools and the things that teachers, educators, administrators have been allowed to get away with. Thinking about the 1619 Project and the the pushback people are giving against us teaching an accurate depiction of history, because white people don't want to reconcile with the fact that, they are violent. Their culture is part of my language, psychotic. That's just a part of their culture. And they let that, infiltrate every aspect of life. And just in the interest of time, because I can go on and on, I'm interested to hear, what my elders have to say and what everyone on the panel has to say and all that.
Okay, all right, and thank you for that. So it sounds like one of your suggestions is schools need to focus more on developing the Black mind, and I would also say not just the Black mind, of course, white students, all students, right? Because they're out of that. There's an appreciation and respect and value that grows when you kind of understand who someone is, and counterbalancing that with all of the negative images and stereotypes that we see daily, we're bombarded with. Other thoughts about the responsibility and the roles that schools have in this area?
You know, we think in terms of schools, and I am totally in agreement with everything I have heard, and I applaud everything I've heard. But for me, from where I sit, everything begins in the family. We have to return to some sort of nuclear family nuclear family understanding. We have to get into the concept of communicating with each other. Everything springs from home. Because of what I learned at home, I can hold my head up outside. If I'm not getting any support at home, or if home is dysfunctional, if let's face it, I mean, let me be brutally honest and frank here. We go through day after day after day being traumatized, re-traumatized, and then on top of that traumatization, we're told, no, it's in your mind. It's not really happening the way you perceiving it. You're misunderstanding it. You're being overly sensitive. Let me go ahead and continue to traumatize you. And you're looking around like, did I or did I not just experience what I experienced? And there is no validation, there's no understanding. So yes, this is a pressure cooker. It builds, it continues to build, and you either become violent towards someone else or you become violent toward yourself.
Mm.
And either way, you're incurring negative responses from the so-called better society of us, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
How
Thank you.
much of it, how much of this are we supposed to really accept without blowing off?
Mm. We all have a
How much of
breaking
it can we?
really. Um, and so there are also some comments in the chat. I don't know if I'm trying to watch the chat too, but there was Tina Swain is saying, and we will, Tina, get to recommendations and solutions. She says she's sitting on the edge of her seat and waiting with bated breath. She wants to understand how a young person, how can a young person be alleviated of those internal struggles. And I think first, kind of understanding what the struggles are. And that's kind of where we're focusing right now, trying to parse and understand what are the factors that contribute to what it is we're seeing. And we will be shifting over shortly to that. Um, uh, Ms. Hickson adds that schools need to teach African Black scholars in the way that African Black scholars learn, through relationship, through energy, through connection. That's huge, right? That's big. We are a people that we vibrate in a different way than other people. Not bad, not good, just we vibrate in a different way. And if we build that into how we relate to young people in the schools, that will allow our young people to be able to absorb and understand and be fed and nourished properly in the school system. Thank you for adding that. I see some affirming comments here. If the schools, Denise says, if the schools won't teach in the way that we need, then we need to teach ourselves. It needs to come from us, from in our families and in our own communities. And I think, Joseph, you really hit that point well, that we've got to solidify our connection and relationships with one another within the family. And again, Ms. Hickson, I agree with the family should all engage in consciousness raising, and racial socialization has been cited to be a protective factor. Absolutely. And so I think, yep, I'm caught with all the comments, but I want to look at, Dr. Cano, if you can kind of chime in here on assessing suicide, and then we can begin to shift over and look at, well, what do we do about this? So for folks out there who don't quite, understand what to look for, what signs are there? How do I know if there's a danger or a risk of suicide? What are some of the risk factors, warning signs of suicidality that people could or should look out for to indicate that someone might be at risk of suicide?
Well, there are over 72 correlating factors that would lead one to think that someone is at a greater risk for suicide. And of course, it would be pointless to try to go into all of them during the course of this seminar. So I'm going to focus on three large ones. There is a physician. His name is Dr. Sean Shea. He is an expert in suicidology, and he came up with what's called a triad of lethality. And the triad of lethality consists of three things. Number one, prior suicide attempts. The person has done it before. They're not on the first rung of the ladder. They've tried to climb that suicide ladder before. The second is rational thought loss, a loss of perspective, a loss of seeing your way out of this, a way, that painting of oneself into a corner where they see no way out except to end their pain. And the third one is an organized plan. And interestingly enough, we talk about connectivity. We were created for connectivity. That's how God created us. We're just a people who were born to connect one with the other. And if we, many times, things we classify as being sudden are not so sudden. If we would have taken a moment and just looked at the people that we're dealing with, look at the people within our family, parents looking at their children, brothers looking at their sisters, sisters looking at their brothers, they would see where things are shifting. It's not as subtle as we may take it to be. Now, let me digress for a moment to this concept of an organized plan. If I ask you, Dr. Swift, and I say, well, I see many people and I talk with them, and many of them are so wound up because of what's been going on, and they don't see a way out, and they're contemplating taking their own life. Is that something that's ever occurred to you? I mean, your answer to that one sentence, that one response, yes, I'm considerate. No, I'm not going to consider it. I can't see myself doing that. I'm a survivalist by nature. It's going to mean so much in the way that we go about approaching resolving the issue, if there is an adequate resolution in a casual conversation. But we have to ask the question.
Mhm.
That's the first thing. We cannot be afraid to ask the question. And when we ask the question, people say, well, if I ask the question, it's going to put the thought in the person's head. No, please don't think that. That is not the case. Sometimes people are relieved when you ask them the question. They feel then that someone is noticing, someone is paying attention. Now, when the question is asked, it can't be asked in a judgmental fashion, because how was it said to me by one of my people? You know how we be. You gonna kill yourself? Is that what you think about doing? You think about killing yourself? In a very judgmental and harsh fashion. Sometimes if you just care enough to exhibit some sensitivity and ask the question in an even matter-of-fact manner, you might be surprised what you get from that. Okay, so these three things I think you should focus on. Also, there are other signs and symptoms. For example, someone who is depressed, someone who you can obviously see has lost pleasure in doing things that they normally would enjoy to do. They like going out to shoot hoops. All of a sudden, they don't feel like shooting hoops anymore. They're hanging around a group of people that are basically just downers. They're on social media all the time, but when they're on social media, you ask to see their phone. Forgive me. I know I'm sounding like I'm all over the place. My colleagues, I beg your pardon. Parents, can we please parent?
Mm.
Can we please not be afraid to parent? I think to some degree, and I'm going to say it, and I'll probably get myself in trouble, we have to stop trying to be best friends and best buddies and go back to being parents. We are raising children. Our children are not raising us. And one of the problems I see in my work, there's a lot of parentification, where the child is acting in the role of the parent almost, and the parent is acting in the role of the child.
Yeah.
Parents have to have the courage to parent. Look, let's see the phone. Let's see what's going on. Talk to me. There's a difference between communication talking to someone or speaking with someone and talking at someone. Now, I can go on about this, but I don't want to burn too much time. My fellow panelists, if you want to chime in, please help me out. But this is a sore spot with me. Parents have to go back to parenting.
Thank you for that. You mentioned the triad. What was the third one? You said a prior suicide attempt, loss of perspective, and what was the third?
An organized plan.
Got it.
You can tell how serious a person is by the way they respond to you when you ask, well, how are you thinking of doing this?
Mm.
You know, they can say something to you like, I thought maybe, wow, I don't know. It's just, I may take some pills. Or I may just walk out in front of a car. No. What about the person that says, well, I know my parents go to work every day and I know where my father keeps his gun. And I'm thinking in terms of like, I'm going to wait for them to go to work. I'm going to wait till my sister leaves for school, and I'm just going to go and I've looked at the gun before. I've seen it, and that's how I'm thinking of doing it. Well, when were you thinking of doing it? Honestly, I was thinking about doing it within the next couple of days. I've had people actually say that. So in assessing the lethality, how organized is the plan? How much have they thought about it? Have you thought about it frequently? How many times a day do you think about killing yourself? What have you done toward doing that, toward perfecting that plan?
Right.
Where have you gone with that?
Also, for folks, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm trying to watch the chat as well, but there was something in the Q&A about spelling. And we don't know, Zion, what you're saying, what you want to be spelled, or he said, say it slowly. If you could come back and retype your question. You used the term when he first started. Oh, triad. I think it was the triad of
The triad of lethality.
Lethality.
Yes,
Okay.
the triad of lethality. And this was developed by an emergency room physician who became a specialist in suicidology. His name is Shawn, SHAWN, Shea, SHEA.
Got it. Yep, that was it. And we're glad you got your question answered. And so you made a few points there. I don't know if anybody else wants to kind of speak to some of the points that were made there in terms of asking the question. I think, I agree, of course, that is important. Often you see people, even I've seen clinicians to some extent, like kind of try to speak to it in more euphemistic ways. Are you thinking about doing something? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Or but people are afraid to speak the word. And I find too, in my experience, that I think it does communicate to the person that I see you, right? It looks to me that you're at this point in your life to say that the word, right? To say suicide, to say, are you thinking about committing suicide? I think there's a certain attention and connection that you can get in asking the question directly. And so people shouldn't be afraid of that. I also very much appreciated your point about parenting. And I feel like in this society, we're kind of pushing toward an atmosphere of anything goes. There's no wrong. Everything is okay. And so when it comes to parenting in particular, there's more of a thrust toward allowing young people to do and be whatever and let them individuate. And you shouldn't impose anything on them. And I do think I agree with your assessment there that parents are somewhat afraid of parenting, and I think society is kind of imposing that on them.
If I can press home this point with the tolerance of my colleagues and everyone, a lot of parents are raising their children in apology mode.
Yeah.
And the currency of guilt is permissiveness. And we have to get away from raising our children as though we're apologizing to them for something we did wrong. Perhaps you may be a single parent household. Perhaps the finances are not what they're supposed to be, but somehow we're sitting in a situation where we are dissatisfied with the way we're living, and we're consistently apologizing to our children. And we don't do it verbally, but we do it in what we allow to go on in our presence.
Yeah.
I've seen that on numerous occasions. And while I just allow me to take 2 more seconds of your time, when working with parents and when working with clients, I use something called the ACT intervention model. It's the ACT intervention model. A stands for ask the question. Don't be afraid to ask the question, and don't be embarrassed or afraid for the answer. It is harder for you to ask the question in most cases than for them to give you the answer. The second is to care. Ask them to tell you more. Open up the lines of communication. As I had mentioned previously, we were created for communication. Every child is born on this planet looking for someone who is looking for them.
Mm.
Everyone is seeking for someone to validate them, to hear them. Hear me when I scream. Hear me when I cry. Have empathy and compassion. It's as simple as caring. And as part of that caring part of it, don't shame them or dismiss their feelings, please. And the T part is tell someone. Confidentiality goes out of the window under these circumstances. You need to share this information and help these people get help. Because they're only 1 degree removed from ourselves. We're all enduring the same thing.
Yes. Yes. Any
And
other
it's a
points?
miracle of God that we haven't fallen, more of us haven't fallen.
Hmm.
I'm sorry. This is a
No,
little bit of a point for me.
no, I'm so glad that you're speaking the way you are. It really does help us to kind of understand, for those people who this is not their profession, is not what they do, you really are helping to shed some light on how they can approach someone with this and what they should pay attention to. We do have a question in the chat, but before that, Ms. Hickson comes in and saying, I think for children, assessing their ability to envision a future is a great assessment tool. Yes, right? So like a child that has like zero plans, don't see themselves there for tomorrow, right? Versus a child that's like, I want to be so-and-so when I grow up. Example, what do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you see yourself in a few months, years? Who do you see yourself being friends with later on or versus now? You can pull so much from these answers as well in terms of how someone or is thinking about their future or having a future at all. So those are really good points of assessment. Thank you for that. And anyone, right? That's a simple thing. You don't have to be clinically inclined to ask those questions and understand what it is that you're hearing. So going back to Denise, and before we go to Denise, is there any other points that anybody wants to make in terms of assessing suicide risk?
Yes, I want to jump in here and really think about some of the cultural manifestations of suicidality and how we have to really be intentional about assessing it from a culturally relevant standpoint. One thing first we know is that in general, across the board culturally for adolescents, oftentimes depression is not the way that adults manifest depression. It may not look like serious depressed mood. It may not look like the sadness and the tearfulness that we stereotypes of what a depressed person looks like. And that's in general, that adolescents tend to manifest depression more with irritability than sadness. And so when we think about that and we add another layer on in terms of cultural manifestations of depression, and we also understand what it means to be cool amongst our young Black males, in our community, oftentimes there is reckless behavior, there is rage, there is a lack of regard for their own safety, and it manifests in terms of sort of what I call, driving down the highway, 100 miles an hour, drinking and drugging, engaging in behaviors that they know will put them in harm's way. Those are manifestations of suicidality at times. When you think about what it means for young Black males, particularly when there are all of these social norms around being tough, being cool, being even for people who have religious values, young Black teens who are growing up in religious families where, it's sinful to take one's life. So again, these cultural values, we have to recognize that it's not always going to manifest the way we think, the way that the standard DSM tells us to look for those symptoms of depressed mood and sadness. And sometimes I think I've seen clinically, at least, that it really shows up as self-destructive behavior, recklessness, rage, and those kinds of things that are subclinical, but are connected to a sense of a foreshortened future and a lack of regard of one's life. So we have to pay attention to that as well.
So while you're there, as a practitioner, a psychology practitioner who's well-versed in kind of looking through an African-centered framework, when you peer through that same lens and look at this phenomenon that we're seeing of suicide, from a traditional African cultural lens, how do we understand this spike, and how do we understand what's going on for our young people? Any thoughts?
Well, I think, it's helpful to first share, what it means to work from an African-centered perspective when we think about mental health, just to sort of make sure that we do some level setting and people sort of are able to think about what that means. And it's really understanding the interconnection between body, mind, and spirit. First and foremost, it is not just about depressed thoughts, right? But it's also about, how are we experiencing ourselves in relation to community, right? When we think about that concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are, we are. And when we think about the spike in suicide rates for Black teens, and we think about it from an African-centered perspective, we have to understand that something's happening spiritually. Something is happening on a deeply spiritual level. And I think that it's where our young people are not able to connect with their divinity. They're not able to see themselves in some ways in a way that's divine. And that doesn't necessarily speak to any form of religious affiliation, but just the idea of you being divine. And also you being a reflection of your family and of your community. Because in essence, taking one's life oftentimes is a very individual act when people think about it. But in an African-centered framework, it affects the entire community. It affects, generations to come, our unborns, the spirits who are waiting to come back, who couldn't come back through you. So I think we have to think about this, as a reflection of how do we restore a connection between young people and their community, young people and their family, young people and their divinity from an African-centered framework.
That was beautifully put. Thank you for that. That was very beautifully put. And there's a lot of, as you were speaking, comments in the chat about, what you're saying is true, and good point. The passive ideation, true to all said Dr. C about self-sabotage. And Ms. Hickson is like, Ashe, she's going to say the same thing. And I don't know if you want to jump in here and add some more.
Yeah, no, literally, I think that was so beautifully said, Dr. Codrington, because I think this Western society has made us to believe that we are not divine, has made us to believe that we are narcissistic if we think that we are divine. And I think that this is spiritual warfare. You know, suicidality in our community is spiritual warfare. And I often think about concepts of like Ubuntu and Ujima. And I'm currently doing my dissertation right now on the identity development of Black American activists. And the research is very telling, you know, what are the reasons that you're doing this work? Because of the children, because of the people that are coming after me, because of my ancestors and elders whose shoulders that I'm able to stand on. And I think that a lot of the times, I often am drawn back to this concept of how are the children, right? And in America, we ask people, what's up, how you doing, whatever. In Africa, in some places, they ask people, how are the children? And that's indicative of how the whole community is doing. And so I think that because we're seeing this pain in you know, in the children, African and Black children, it's definitely reverberating throughout. And I think that just in the same way that they can experience the pain that we're feeling, that our elders are feeling, that our ancestors are feeling, we can feel the same thing. And we just need to get back on the same accord and get back on a similar vibration. So hopefully conversations like this, Black American activists and Black activists in general, and Black psychologists and all of you will continue, you know, we'll continue doing this work so we can get back on the same vibration.
That's right. Thank you. And so, you know, I want to make some space for the comment. Denise said a little while back in the chat, you know, what do you do? So you get this affirmative response, you ask the question, you go through the act, right? You get this affirmative response that the youth does want to kill themselves. What does a family member do, or a friend, or an average person do if you don't have that clinical background? Also, if we could, you know, tap into, as we're responding to this one, we talked about a lot of the risk factors, but there are also protective factors that are meaningful when it comes to suicide. So if we could also kind of build into your responses, you know, what are the protective factors that we can tap into as we are responding to someone who might be affirming that they are suicidal? Joseph, can we start with you?
Well, as it's been echoed by my colleagues, spirituality and faith are critical here. Other factors are communication, strong familial support. That's there has to be a gathering. There has to be a coming together surrounding that individual that is contemplating this. Once it's established, it is not something to shame the individual. It's something to gather around and support the individual. We have to work on developing a higher level of our I guess for the want of a better term, I'll say our ethnic identification. Correct me if I'm wrong with that, but I think we need to work on a higher level of that. And, you know, in addressing the church in this specifically, because that's a lot, that's where much of my orientation comes from. The church has almost been suppressive in their dealing with mental health issues. There's a statement, and I know if there are any pastors that are listening to this, they'll probably want to have me tarred and feathered after this. But the church is the only army that we're aware of that shoots its wounded. Okay, so you know, we have to acknowledge that mental health is an issue within the church, and begin to look at each other in terms of that healing. Like I said before, we're all born looking for someone who is looking for us. We need to have that level of communication. We need to build that positive self-esteem. We need, you know, the old statement is, it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to sustain a life.
Yes, yes.
We have to look at each other, and we have to, you know, this all ties into the economic end of things. It all ties into I mean, we all witnessed severe trauma last week. I don't know how many of you realize it. One of our legal minds, our finest legal minds, was subjected to the worst kind of abuse simply by virtue of the fact that she is a Black woman applying for a seat on the highest court. I don't know why they didn't just come out and say, look, you're Black, you shouldn't be here. I mean, honestly, I would have much preferred that. But then we see the obvious trauma that comes from that, the re-trauma that comes from that, by saying, "Oh no, we didn't really do any harm to her. We didn't hurt her. We didn't, black young women, black young men seeing that kind of behavior, they shouldn't be discouraged from applying for higher positions in the educational realm, in the legal realm. No, 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 no. All of that, the worst thing that can ever happen is for me to traumatize somebody and then lead them to believe that the trauma never occurred. We have to dignify our own trauma here. And that is part of the healing process, to bring dignity to the trauma that we have sustained.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense or is helpful,
Well,
but we have to focus. This all goes to our emotional well-being. I'm sorry, doctor.
No, that's why I was just sharing. We got an amen in the chat, so I think it's resonating with folks. And also, someone mentioned, Denise mentioned gaslighting, or what you were talking about as well. Other comments on that? Any other thoughts on that?
Could I,
Yeah,
not to
go right ahead.
monopolize, but listen. Just a quick note on the Bible speaking on suicide, because I've had this conversation at least 4 times in the last week. There are 7 suicides listed in Scripture, 6 by intent and 1 by natural consequence. There is no place where the Bible speaks of it as automatically going to hell. So we have to be very careful about making people feel that we're not causing people not to want to commit suicide. What we're causing people to do is to hide the fact that they want to commit suicide. And that's my concern. Because we can't address the rage of any man lies in an inability for him to articulate his concerns. Okay, so we have to allow that at least to be expressed, so we can heal. We can work on the healing, because the only way we're going to heal is as a family. We're not going to heal as individuals. The Eurocentric concept of psychology, where we're all individualistic and everything is about me, it doesn't work for people of color.
That's right.
It just simply doesn't work. And Dr. Swift, you're familiar with Dr. Williams' position on this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That we're
So
referring to Dr. Dan Williams here.
yes, and as I've put a couple of road miles on myself, I've come to realize that he is very, very accurate with what he is saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. You cannot, and that's a huge thrust of the Association of Black Psychologists, to not kind of just put a Black face on psychology, but to come from a Black space, right? To apply a genuine, organic way of understanding who we are and looking at us from that frame, and not from a frame that doesn't really account for who we are. And so thank you for that perspective. Larry, as here in the chat, can you talk about the ways in which young people feel overwhelmed by the roles they play at home and how that affects their mental health? I guess there could be some interpretation for that in terms of the roles that they play. Not exactly sure what you mean, but oftentimes, he clarifies, oftentimes our youth have to play peacemakers at home, act as a voice of reason to their parents and parent to their siblings. So I guess this whole parentification, Dr. Connell, you spoke about that, but the pressure that our young people feel in having to, be peacemakers in their home. Any thoughts about that?
I can jump in here. I think that when we think about all of the interactive systems, right? We think about how many young people have a parent who's currently incarcerated. We think about how many young people have parents who are debilitated by their own mental health issues. How many young people have parents who are dealing with major substance use and misuse. This issue of parentification is very real. And I work with a number of youngsters in my clinical practice where, you know, they're cooking dinner at 9 years old, they're putting their younger siblings to bed, they're helping out with homework. And
Yes.
for a number of different reasons, you know, whether it's also, you know, the single mother who works 2 jobs and is also going to school, you know, it's not only because of, you know, the family dysfunction, but sometimes, you know, what it means to literally have a way to make ends meet, right? With the opportunities that are available. It's not a 9-to-5 job and you come home and you take care of your family. You know, our single parents are working multiple jobs and trying to do things. So I have seen, I love this question because I have seen that what should be a protective factor, which is the family, the cohesiveness of the family, turns into something that is a barrier because of the extended roles that have to be played for young people and the stress that occurs. And what happens is that they oftentimes start to witness, you know, very early what it means to not put yourself first, right? And they start to fall behind sometimes academically in their schoolwork. They become stressed with trying to get siblings to do things when they don't have really that parental authority. And so it can create sometimes sibling conflict. There's this real barrier that I've faced with some of my clients where they don't even make their therapy appointments because, you know, they're cooking the meals, you know, and they're helping little brother, little sister with their homework. And so it really does start to chip away at the ability for our young people to not only survive and thrive, but to be able to tend to their own emotional issues. And so this is where the ethos of communalism comes in for us as African people. Where is the extended family? Where are, you know, where are the charismatic adults in the community that allow for these young people to be able to be alleviated of some of these stressors? Where are some of the neighbors, the aunties, the godfathers, right, that could step in when these young people have these parentified roles? And also, where are the community supports so that things that are basic needs of the family don't have to be outsourced to the children?
Yeah, wow. Very good points mentioned there. I don't know if anybody else wants to add on, but it looks like, well, Jennifer comes back and saying, I see a lot of role reversal with the family. You get real clear understanding of that because it's easy to say, well, just don't do it, right? It's easy to say, shame on you as a parent, you shouldn't, you know, parentify your children, you should, you know, but the reality, particularly for Black people, is that we're struggling with everything we have to make it work. And you know, sometimes that means that young people pick up some of the burden. So that is a reality, and that's a reality that we shouldn't be shamed for, right? But you make such sense when you say, okay, so where's the extended family, right? Where's the neighbor? Where's the uncle and auntie? Where's the community that's coming together to make sure that there's some sort of balance here, that the young person is not holding too much of a burden? I think it was a really beautiful point. Thank you. Jonisha saying, I think we need a paradigm shift. We can't say village mentality and Ujima, but not have flexibility of roles balance. Balance is necessary, but sometimes those roles shift are needed to sustain the family. So yeah, to that point, the same point, it's natural. It's a reality for many of us sometimes. And so, but we have to balance it, right? We have to kind of bring that village back to life. Any other thoughts here?
I think also I was going to add as I guess, a protective factor, in the same way that we encourage outside communities to introspect and, check themselves about their racism. I think we also need to do the same thing. I know in my, the millennial age group, I guess, we're struggling a lot with older generations perpetuating respectability politics. So like we saw like Monique going off on Black women wearing bonnets in the airport. And it's just like, I felt like, that will force people away from the community because while it might look a certain way, we don't know everybody's predicament. What if somebody just lost a family member and they're rushing to the airport and they don't have time or the capacity to do their hair or think about their hair? And so I think that those messages are perpetuated when we're telling Black boys, like, don't be trying to be a rapper, don't be trying to be a sports star, don't be doing podcasts, when really the market is already oversaturated. We have the same white people, doing the same roles and being actors and looking the same way and playing the same parts. But when it comes to Black people, we're telling them your dream needs to be something different, like you need to do something different. And while of course that might be a protective factor because, like J. Cole said, there's only 12 spots on the Pistons. We still can't allow that to discourage people from even trying to pursue their dreams or looking at it differently. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I was just thinking about respectability politics and how that might play a huge role in some of our mental health.
Okay, thank you for that, adding that in there, Ms. Hickson. So there's one more question, and I'm looking at time, and we do have to wrap up. So if you want to respond to this, I also want to kind of give people an opportunity to have like a 1 minute, if less, kind of concluding thought if you'd like to. But Tina asks, when do you suggest coming together as a family unit if the young person is not yet welcome to discussing it outside of their therapist? How to open that doorway to get supportive family involved? Not real clear on what you're asking here, Tina. When do you suggest come together as a family unit if young person is not yet welcome to discussing it outside of their therapist? That's the part that's throwing me. How to open the doorway to get a supportive family involved. I guess I'm gathering that she's asking something. Dr. Connell said communication is key, how to get that to happen. Okay, that's what she's saying. So if you could, in 1 minute or less, wrap up, if you could kind of speak to that, if we could kind of defer to you, Dr. Connell, communication being key, how to get our families to communicate more, to open up and be candid and honest about what's going on. And then we could just kind of go around to everyone else.
First of all, we have to be able to listen, whether we agree or we disagree, extend each other the courtesy of listening. Listening not with just your ears, but listening with your heart. I remember, and I guess I'm going to be showing my age slightly here for everyone, please forgive me. I remember the time of the Sunday dinner. I remember the time when people gathered and just enjoyed each other's fellowship and it was nothing specific going on. I remember when we didn't have to have an agenda. We just spoke with each other. I remember the days of mama and grandmama and grandfather. Yeah, I will share honestly. My parents often didn't agree with some of the wildness that came out of my mouth when I was coming up. I'm sure they thought I had my own pathology going on, but they paid me the courtesy of listening. We have to learn how to not speak so much, but listen.
Yeah.
Listen. A few well-placed words are important. Listen.
The better side of communication, listening. Thank you for that. Dr. Codrington, Ms. Hickson, you can, last words?
Yeah, I would share modeling vulnerability. When we think about this, every stream has a source, and our young people can communicate their vulnerabilities when we can communicate our own.
Agreed.
And when we can model what it means to literally say, I'm worried, I'm scared. I don't know sometimes how to handle some of the issues around COVID or, you know, the race-based violence, rather than trying to hide them or trying to act as if children are too vulnerable to hear about our concerns as adults. There's a fine line between oversharing and burdening our children with our pain and modeling vulnerability. So I think we need to begin to open up more and also talk about how we navigate our own issues. What is it that we do when we feel overwhelmed? Who do we go to? How do we tap in to our own inner resources and raise our vibrational energy? And how do we manage situations where we feel disempowered? That creates reciprocity. And young people are not given up information if they're not feeling that vulnerability can be shared. And I think that's what we sometimes miss. We try to be the rock for our young people, and we have to model some vulnerability.
Sure,
Love
I
that.
agree.
Ms. Hickson, can you wrap it up?
Yes.
Very briefly.
I agree with what was previously said, and I think this is why it's crucial to find an African-centered clinician, because you cannot, you have to meet this individual where they are. There's a reason that they don't feel safe and vulnerable, like Dr. Condrington said, sharing that information. So I think that while working with a Black or African-centered psychologist, the family's input is integral. And I think that by consulting with the family and meeting with the individual, you can serve as a liaison between them and try to facilitate, a safe pathway for the child to feel comfortable sharing, their suicidal thoughts with the parents.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I, as we wrap up, I just want to share, because people need to know that they're not alone, right? You're not alone in this process. Yes, I think some great tips have come forward from our panelists today, but there are other professionals out there. If you want to see professional help, there's a National Suicide Prevention Hotline. There are now crisis text lines. The Steve Fund also has a text line, and there are numerous other community resources on Congressman Watson Coleman's website. So if you go to that website and go to community resources, you'll find things that way. So I hope people are kind of taking a snapshot of this, and you can share this with people or use it for your own benefit. But I just want a few closing words from me. I want to leave you with the wisdom of and words of two of our great warriors. One is James Baldwin, who said, "People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction." And warrior Angela Davis, who said, "I am no longer accepting the things that I cannot change. I am changing the things that I cannot accept." We're facing, folks, a reality that is very grim, that is very dismal, right? The death of our babies, right? It's ugly, it's awful in every way, but we can't turn away. It's a reality that we must change, and we cannot accept. And so it's imperative that we look at it, and we look at it again and again until we're able to understand it and stop it. And so with that, I thank you all for your attendance this evening, for your input, for your questions. Thank you for being with us, and have a good night. Thank you to the panelists as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Take care, everyone. God bless.